Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lauren Henke, and I'm joined by our co-host, Stephen Chun, for another NRG Oncology Podcast episode. Today, we are venturing a little outside what we've covered in the past. We're very pleased to have Dr. Anna Brown, who is a radiation oncologist on the NRG Genitourinary Committee and the Health Disparities Committee. While many of us know her for her work with NRG Oncology, what you might not know about her is her work with the American Medical Association. And so today we are pleased to have Dr. Brown to speak about potential synergy between NRG Oncology and the American Medical Association as we are ever looking for ways to advocate for clinical trials.
Dr. Brown, I want to welcome you. And first off, can you tell us about where the values of NRG Oncology and the AMA align in terms of policy and advocacy? And what should our audience know about AMA policy and advocacy as it pertains to NRG Oncology?
Sure, I'd be happy to do so. And thank you so much for having me on as a guest. I'm really excited about this new NRG Oncology podcast, and I'm really excited about this topic as well because it's so important to our field of radiation oncology. Well, I've currently actually transitioned now within the American Medical Association, or AMA, from a nationally elected role with the Women's Physician section, first as a resident and fellow representative, and most recently as the alternate delegate for the entire section, which represented half of the AMA, all female physicians, to now I'm officially, as of this upcoming meeting in November, the alternate delegate for the American College of Radiation Oncology, ACRO, to the House of Delegates of the AMA. So I'm one of four radiation oncologists in an official capacity, kind of at the table in the room, advocating for radiation oncology. And so what's interesting about the AMA is there's a lot of lobbying power and a lot of ability to help kind of set the agenda and priorities for advocacy on the Hill, Capitol Hill, as well as regional and local advocacy efforts with Congress people around, issues important to their constituents, which I think for a lot of us, or I would hope in radiation oncology and other oncology related fields, that includes enrolling patients onto clinical trials. So I've been involved in a lot of those efforts with both the AMA as well as, in my capacity as a board certified radiation oncologist, have helped enroll many, many patients onto NRG Oncology as well as other cooperative group trials. But I think the key thing is how can we best have our treatments and kind of how can we have a representative sample of patients on those trials so that way it's applicable to all patients, regardless of their background or where they live? Well, I think one of the best ways is to actually enroll minority and rural patients onto clinical trials. But how do we do that, right? How do we get the trials to where the patients live? Because a lot of these patients who are of those minority kind of groups, whether geographical, racial, or otherwise, they may not have the means or the ability to get to a large academic center where we kind of traditionally think of these clinical trials being run. Well, one of the ways is involving like NCORE, the NCI Community Oncology Research Program, those sorts of groups, which is part and parcel with NRG Oncology. NCORE is a huge amount of the clinical trial accrual. I think somewhere like 30 to 40% are NCORE sites, making sure that minority and rural patients, one, are eligible for the trial, and number two, are actively kind of accrued onto the trials. And I think the AMA can help with this in a number of ways. I think first, we need to be in the room at the table. Number two, the more we can work with, for example, the Health Disparities Committee. There's actually a rural special interest group or rural SIG, and the HDC as well has a number of ongoing efforts. And so the more that we can kind of have cross-pollination between the AMA in terms of the advocacy efforts and kind of talking with Congress folks about how important this is, then and align those values with our efforts in the clinic, the more harmony there can be. So I'll stop there and kind of see your guys' thoughts on that and then what other questions you might have.
I think that's fantastic. And I genuinely think you're spot on that there is a lot of overlap in this Venn diagram of how we advocate and reach these patients through these different organizations and where we can borrow strengths from one and really collaborate in our efforts, not just in trials themselves, but also in the ways that we reach patients. That's going to be fruitful for all involved. And you've been involved with the AMA, with the Women's Physician section, like you said, governing council, and as an alternate delegate to the House of Delegates now. What have been your personal goals with the AMA, and what kind of work does this entail?
That's a great question, Lauren. Yeah, it's really kind of multi-level and multifactorial, almost like a clinical trial or any kind of research lab. I view the health policy work as when you think across the spectrum of like implementation science, for example, you might come up with a wonderful idea in the lab. And in our field in particular, there's a lot of really technical stuff, right? Like really cool technology, like Flash comes to mind, all the adaptive therapy, really cool stuff. But actually, what I'm most interested in, just on a personal level, and this just comes from really my foundation of like global health work that I did in undergrad and other areas, founding some global health organizations, was how do we get like the most basic care done? Like for patients in radiation oncology, that would mean getting the patient to the treatment facility and like point A to point B type stuff. So how does that get done? Well, number one, we need to identify barriers and right again, kind of implementation science wise, what are the barriers to patients getting any sort of treatment, let alone the most fancy treatment? Well, number one is, do patients have access to transportation? Do they have the ability to take time off from maybe one of the three jobs they're working and their five children they're feeding to come in for treatment? So number one, we need to kind of, in a structural way, identify the barriers to care, which ties into like social determinants of health or SDOH. And I looked at some of those things in residency. And then when I kind of got involved with the AMA more in residency, then I thought about, okay, from a policy standpoint, how can we leverage policy tools to help us then advocate for our patients? And thus, and sometimes, right, advocating for our patients might mean helping with physician burnout or fixing prior authorization. And then ultimately, the downstream effect, right, if we have more well rested, happier doctors that don't have to keep making prior auth phone calls all the time, then they'll be better able to care for their patients. It's like the airline saying of, put on your own oxygen mask first and then you can help others. And that's the classic burnout teaching. But right, those are some of the pillars of the AMA is actually this like physician recovery plan. And so those are some of the things that we always talk about with Congress members. And then I know Astro and ACRO and ASCO and kind of all these various organizations, ACR, there's all these advocacy days that we can do too, but the AMA just pulls together all the resources of everyone into kind of common goals that, right, like as a radiation oncologist, we may face these, but so do, other subspecialty fields. And so a lot of the work that I do in the policy space with the AMA is helping build coalitions to support resolutions that would be of interest. So, for example, I was just on a email chain the other day and previous phone calls for the ACRO-GREC, the Government Relations and Economics Committee, focused on building a resolution that will address kind of the payment reform issues in radiation oncology and other fields, like even cardiology subspecialists have a vested interest in this. And so with the AMA, it just brings all of us together. And there's also like a rural caucus and these various groups that we can come together, form coalitions, and then all work towards common goals.
Now, one of the major ways that the AMA can help affect policy is through the resolution process. Can you fill us in? What exactly is the resolution process, and how might it be used to address barriers to clinical trial enrollments and improve inclusion on trials?
That's a great question, Stephen. So the AMA resolution process, it's structured with a parliamentary process. So for example, various sections or even individuals could author a resolution. There are various deadlines to adhere to. And so, for example, for the upcoming interim meeting, is really focused on kind of more specific, kind of a narrower, like true advocacy priorities, whereas our annual meeting, typically in June for the AMA, is focused on kind of really everything. But effectively, there's these various deadlines, just like a grant deadline, right? You kind of have to think of what the overall deadline is and then work backwards to figure out if you're going to build a coalition around a resolution or multiple authors or co-sponsors, then you got to work really, really early. But anyway, generally the process is brainstorming ideas that'll be effectively broadly supported. Kind of we call it in the AMA, or this isn't technical by any means, but like apple pie and ice cream. Like, it's kind of, the stuff that should be okay with everyone. And then the whole thing is either an individual or maybe a section, like the women's physician section, for example, might author a resolution. There's a whole process for that. And then it gets effectively eventually introduced into the House of Delegates for consideration. And that each society actually gets one representative delegate for their society for every 1,000 members. And so, right, for Astro and Acro, there's only one delegate each. And then actually the women physician section, there's just one delegate. For resident and fellow section, there's one delegate. You can imagine, right, for the women physician section, which I was most recently involved in for the past 3 years as alternate delegate, it's the delegate and myself that really coordinated the policy process. We work with individuals to put it into the right format. There's lots of whereas clauses for the background, and then effectively the action statement, which is the only thing that stays around in the AMA policy finder eventually, is something called the resolved clause, which will say something like resolve that the AMA advocate for X, or that the AMA, and then there's specific directive for actions and things like that. And there's various ways it can be structured. And I actually learned about this when I was a Duke medical student, being involved with the medical student section, or MSS. And I was like a regional delegate to, some North Carolina State Medical Society events. And actually my very first meeting, ironically enough, was in Hawaii, where I presented a research project and ended up getting, some random award, which I was, like very happy about. And then I'm like, oh, actually there's more interesting things than just research for the AMA, but there's lots of ways to get involved. And I'd say out there for anyone interested in this process, there's actually workshops through like virtual, Zoom workshops through the women physician section and other sections on kind of how to write a resolution and kind of what's the eventual goal of that, what's the ultimate impact. And the downstream effect, I would say, for our field is, right, if the AMA has standing policy that says like the AMA will advocate for, fixing prior authorization, for example, right? Just kind of a generic statement there that may not be a specific resolution. However, right, if they have a resolution that says something like that, then we can use it in Astro or Acro advocacy days to actually bring that to Congress as a talking point and say, Congress member X, or, Mr. So-and-so, did you know that the AMA advocates for this, and Astro supports it too, and Acro supports it too? And then you start getting like a snowball effect. And I know I've seen that recently for some of the Astro and Acro letters to Congress, or CMS even, CMMS, that, if the AMA supports it, then it's kind of creates and opens the door for other organizations to kind of bandwagon onto it as well.
It's really fascinating how those processes work and how it can create momentum that can help our field. One of the big shifts I think we've seen in our lifetime is that significant numbers of patients are now being treated for cancer in locations that are closer to home, in suburban and even rural cancer centers. I think almost half of patients are treated for cancer in these settings. And it is a struggle then sometimes to get patients access to things like NRG oncology trials that may be more centrally located. Might there be an opportunity through the AMA Rural Caucus to help address these issues that impact these patients? How might the AMA advocate so that smaller institutions get federal funds to hire research staff so patients can be enrolled on clinical studies?
Yeah, that's a great point, Lauren. And I think that the Rural Caucus is, just one such coalition, or, caucus as it's called, of ways that we can come together through the AMA. But I think definitely the resolution writing, authoring, advocacy, and getting it published, that's a great way to, effectively have the AMA devote some of it, because effectively the end action, right, of any of these resolutions is then that kind of helps with agenda setting for the board of trustees and other kind of elected, very high leader representatives within the AMA for agenda setting and priority setting for how the resources of the AMA will be used. And so I think for your specific question of to help rural or, let's say non-urban clinical trial access, I think the key thing is to, even for big academic institutions that may have satellite or kind of outreach sites more in the community, I know that sometimes there can be a disparity in terms of access to clinical trials that may only be available at the main institution, which may have like the credentials or the, specific for in our field, especially like the imaging quality is of such a standard that it's acceptable for the clinical trial. So then only certain sites can enroll. And I experienced that most recently in a facility that I had worked at, actually two of them, where like our main site had certain clinical trials open, but we didn't necessarily have the resources, whether it was personnel or technical resources, to have the trials open at other sites. And then that can be a barrier Because if there's a LINAC closer to where the patient lives and they just want the standard treatment, it's going to be an extra step for them to do the clinical trial and maybe drive an hour to the main site to be on the clinical trial. Now, sometimes we could convince patients to do that, but oftentimes it was hard. So I would say, honestly, it's definitely a two-way process where I think both from the clinical trial development standpoint, which would mean people involved in like the NRG Oncology or other cooperative group clinical trial development, just to be mindful that, right, even if there's certain technical standards, like, are they really necessary for the trial? Or, just to kind of play devil's advocate, if you have, for example, I know NRG Oncology has this, and one of my colleagues is involved in some of these efforts as like a community oncology representative for some of these clinical trial developments. I think that's one of the best ways. And then to just listen to their opinion, right? Because, I think that's where these discussions can be very helpful, whether it's NCORE or just, NRG Oncology in general. Just to be mindful that, sometimes if questions are about, does the criteria really have to be so strict? It's not so much to degrade the quality of the study, but more just thinking about, right, in the community oncology setting, which is where, as you alluded to, many patients receive their care because they don't want to drive 2 hours to an academic center that they don't know how to navigate. They'd rather get it in their community site where it's more convenient for them. Then thinking about, okay, well, sometimes the questions come up because, for example, right, the turnaround time for like even scheduling MRIs or PET scans, for example, the MRI machine and the PET machines in some of these communities where I've worked are literally drive by me on the highway in a truck. And so, right, when you think about, okay, how soon can we get the MRI? It depends if it didn't hit a deer, right? Which is just something you don't think about in the academic setting necessarily. But, right, so maybe instead of having like a 24-hour turnaround time for checking some sort of, GBM imaging, maybe a 72-hour or, like something reasonable, like having a range can then be helpful. So that way it's like, okay, you can have an ideal criteria for the clinical trial of certain eligibility, enrollment things. But, some of these windows can then make patients ineligible if they, or for example, if they already came in with some sort of outside MRI and they didn't want to repeat it, or repeating it would delay their care by a month, then I literally won't enroll that patient on a clinical trial because I don't want to delay their care. So there's just a lot of weird nuances and downstream effects. But I think one of the ways is actually just involving a community oncologist, whether that's rad onc, surg onc, med onc, that could just bring up some of these types of, unfortunately, kind of wet blanket or stick in the mud concerns, but that they are asked for a reason.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I am a provider who treats patients in a community-based center, and I think of trials where some of the laboratory correlates required a 24-hour shipping time in order to meet those parameters of the trial, even though that had really not much to do with the primary endpoint. And we were sending patients all the way from this center into the main campus to get those labs drawn. I mean, they did it, but reluctantly. But these are certainly big issues that we're grappling with as a country. Now, one thing I'd like to ask specifically about, I know you touched on this a little earlier, but one issue I face is when I'm enrolling patients on, for example, NRG proton trials, there are often lengthy prior authorizations, appeals, peer-to-peer discussions, and these are huge disincentives for providers who want to offer clinical trials that are asking questions about the role of new and innovative technologies. And I wanted to find out from you, how is the AMA trying to specifically address these authorization issues, when it comes to testing advanced technologies like, say, protons, or perhaps soon to be heavy ion therapy that we're seeing, being developed at Mayo Clinic, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question, Stephen. So it's actually one of the main pillars, as I may have alluded to earlier, of what's called like a physician recovery plan of the AMA, which addresses burnout, as well as other things. Like there's literally a hashtag fix prior auth, and I think the website, maybe I can fact check later myself, but I think it's fixpriorauth.org or something like that. But effectively, it's a huge priority of the AMA right now, and something that we can really all band behind, especially those of us with direct patient care responsibilities, such as all of us in radiation oncology, or the vast majority of us if we have any clinic time. Because, right, as you alluded to, for clinical trial enrollment, if the protocol specifies that certain studies must be done now, sometimes insurance companies will be okay with that, but oftentimes not. I mean, what I've found, and as you've sort of alluded to, especially for newer technologies, like even the Indicate trial and the post-op prostate setting, looking at PSMA PET, like getting that second PSMA PET authorized, depending on the time interval, can actually be a huge challenge. And you end up having to escalate the peer-to-peer to something like a medical director level, which that's a discussion for a separate day, I think, where there's a whole bunch of pain points there where the medical director may not even be a radiation oncologist. And then it's kind of like, okay, well, how can you deny, for example, as you alluded to, like proton or some other sort of treatment if they're not a board certified radiation oncologist, or at least board eligible? So
Oh,
yeah,
absolutely. I
that's a
remember
huge challenge. Yeah. Oh,
yeah,
go ahead. Yeah.
I remember getting I think an emergency room doctor once doing the review on intensity modulated radiation, and I just couldn't believe it.
Yeah, well, and one other issue, Stephen, that's come up recently in in discussions with I think in ACRO, and I won't give all the specifics because a lot of that's confidential, but effectively it was someone who wasn't even a doctor, like an NP, ended up being the peer-to-peer. And it's like, no, like literally they didn't even go to medical school, let alone through the 4 board certification exams we did, or have any sort of idea of the technology we use. But that's a huge challenge if especially in rural settings, I've found that, right, who I end up talking with in terms of the prior auth, well, especially with those auto denials now. I feel like during the pandemic, unfortunately, a lot of these insurance companies, they used AI literally create algorithms to deny it. And I think I saw some statistics somewhere that, and this is in a field different than us, but for emergency medicine purposes, literally this like urine drug screen was denied more than 96% of the time by an auto denial algorithm. Well, clearly the algorithm's wrong if it's denying a test 96% of the time. I mean, why do you think people are ordering urine drug screens? Like, it's probably people coming in, they're concerned they're on drugs. So I don't know. It's just like, I mean, that's a whole different thing. But as you can tell by the passion in my voice, this is something that a lot of people in the AMA feel passionately about, and it contributes to burnout, right? Which again gets to that whole catch-22 of if you're kind of starving for oxygen, how can you give some patient any oxygen at all, right? So we need some breathing room to be able to do the work we do in a way that doesn't cause us so many headaches. And so, right, that's where the AMA comes in and can put a lot of, advocacy power behind that. There's a whole website on kind of covering all the various ways that they're addressing, fixing the prior auth issue. And there have been some legislative wins. So I think on that website, which I'll send to you guys after the show here, just so you can link it maybe on the show notes or something. But the cool thing is there have been some legislative wins, however minor, right? We've got to celebrate the wins that there have been of recent times, I think in the past few years, some legislative laws, passed that effectively are trying to swing the pendulum away from, favoring the insurance companies, was actually are maybe the only cohort that grew richer during the pandemic, whereas the rest of us were squeezed. To say, okay, well, how is this patient centered if we're denying care that, right, especially in our field that's so technical, just because people don't understand what IMRT is doesn't mean they should deny it, right? If it's appropriate and at least it should be evaluated by a true peer. I think that's like the bare minimum to ask for. And so I know that there are some ongoing resolutions and other policy in the works, at least for the June 2025 annual meeting at the AMA, kind of along these points. And just really quick, one of the best ways I think that we have to band together in terms of the technical aspect of the work we do is something called the Radiology Section Council of the AMA, which incorporates the 4 kind of main pillars of, effectively the House of Radiology, which is diagnostic radiology, of course, interventional radiology, nuclear medicine, and radiation oncology. And so, right, there's actually quite a few radiation oncologists in that room, and including me, but also some very powerful people in the AMA, like Sheila Reggae is another radiation oncologist in our field. She's actually going to be running for the board of trustees of the AMA, which is really exciting for our field to potentially support someone in that way. And there actually are several radiologists currently on the board of trustees of the AMA. So I think the more we can have allies. Another thing, the RUC, the Reimbursement Utilization Committee, effectively, which defines how we're all reimbursed. And there's a permanent spot for a radiologist in that committee. And so the more that we can ally with our radiology colleagues, I think the better we can all work together, right? Because we're just the other side of the coin. We're the therapeutic radiologists. But our diagnostic friends are the ones that are just a larger body of people, and their pack is very big too.
Well, we appreciate you being such an active part of that pack and that group and the people in that room. And, for our audience members, oncologists, radiation oncologists, surgical oncologists alike who want to get more involved with the AMA to help advocate for NRG oncology and cancer care in general, what advice would you give them? Are there certain areas like the AMA Council on Medical Science or other groups that you would direct them toward?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lauren. So, yeah, with the AMA, and I know I'm speaking from experience here, it can be very daunting because it's like the entire House of Medicine. So it's, like I mentioned, in that room of the House of Delegates, for each person who has a seat in the room as a delegate, they're representing 1,000 people, or potentially more, right? Like the women's physician section, it represents like all female physicians. So the way to get involved, I would say, just like I've done anything in anything I've done in my life, is to show up, be consistent, and be engaged. And so, right, that usually starts at the volunteer level, but even at the local level, that's one of the lowest hanging fruits, the county level. So, for example, when I was in Michigan, well, there was one year that I literally ran for a position for one of these nationally elected positions with the WPS, the Women Physicians section, and I lost. It was actually during the pandemic, so it was virtual anyway. I lost to a medical dean, so I was like, okay, it's probably okay. I'm a resident, she's a dean, it's fine. But what I did is I got involved at the local level. So the Washtenaw County Medical Society, for example, I got involved with that. And there often are like resident and student level roles that you can do with like the MSS, for example, for medical students. There's these like medical student section regional delegates. So as a medical student, it's highly encouraged to be involved. And there's like research competitions. You even get a save on your Netters cards or whatever the latest resource is. That was also why I joined the AMA as a first year med student. I was like, I want my Netters cards for free, please. So yes, it was like, there's lots of cool stuff like that. And as a resident, even if you don't have a national role, right, there's like also state level delegates and ways you can get involved with your state medical societies. So like Michigan State Medical Society, MS, and actually our incoming president of the AMA, Bobby Mukala, it was first involved heavily in the Michigan State Medical Society because he practices medicine in Michigan. Then at the national level, of course, that's kind of the next level, but there is the Radiology Section Council, which there's opportunities with the governing council, the nominating committee, which I'm on, to kind of help choose candidates for various things. So there's a lot of kind of leadership roles and ways to get involved, and a lot of it just starts with asking questions, showing up, showing that you're interested, learning about the process. And it's okay to ask questions and to not know, especially at the first meeting, because many people don't know. But I'd say just in terms of location, the annual meeting is pretty much every year, the week after ASCO in Chicago. It's not at McCormick, though, it's at Hyatt Regency. The AMA is like always there. And so, if you happen to live near Chicago, then, you can kind of show up to that. And oftentimes, even just for a weekend, you can go for a few days just to kind of figure out what it's all about and then decide on the level of engagement and kind of figure it out. Because it takes a few times, even for me, I had no idea what I was doing the first few times, really. And then I started to understand the process to the level I do now.
Dr. Brown, thanks so much again for joining us and opening our minds to the possibilities of synergy between NRG Oncology and the American Medical Association. And I really want to thank you for everything you're doing to advocate with the AMA for our cancer patients. The NRG Oncology Group is supported by grant funding from the National Cancer Institute, and content does not necessarily reflect their views. Thanks for tuning in, and happy clinical trials.